This really happened to me, and for a long time, I was too ashamed to tell anyone. But now, I think it's a story that needs to be told. The soft glow of the Edison bulbs in the alley cast long dancing shadows as I pressed myself against the cool brick of the service entrance. Inside Aura, through the pristine glass of the kitchen window, I watched Julian Croft, my former boss and mentor, place a single perfect plate in front of Chicago's most feared food critic. It was my dish, the seared scallop with yuzu foam and black garlic reduction, the one I had sketched, tested, and perfected in my tattered notebook for months. He leaned in, his voice a confident murmur I could feel, even through the glass. And then I saw him step back, take the microphone for the press night, and address the hushed, adoring room. "True genius," he announced, his smile as brilliant and false as a stage prop, "is about vision, not service. It can't be found on a serving tray." And just like that, in front of everyone who mattered in the city, he had not only stolen my future, he was mocking the very moment he had destroyed my past. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. It had all started with a dream, as these things so often do. I arrived in Chicago with 2 overstuffed suitcases, a culinary degree from a decent but not quite prestigious school, and a fire in my belly that burned hotter than any 6-burner range. I wanted to cook, to create, to forge a new path in American cuisine. But I knew the rules. You don't just walk into a city like this and get handed a chef's toque. You pay your dues, you start at the bottom. For me, that meant taking a job as a waitress at the most talked-about new restaurant in the West Loop, Aura. Aura was Julian Croft's masterpiece. The man himself was a culinary demigod, at least according to the glossy pages of Chicago Magazine. He had the rugged good looks of a man who wrestled with flames for a living, a charmingly disheveled curl of dark hair that always fell perfectly over his brow, and a voice that could coax a confession from a stone. He spoke of food not as a product, but as a philosophy. He was a storyteller, and his restaurant was his stage. I was mesmerized. I hung on his every word during pre-shift meetings, my server's notepad filled less with dinner specials and more with his poetic ramblings about the terroir of a parsnip or the emotional resonance of a properly rendered duck fat. The restaurant's general manager, Elise Vance, was the icy yin to his fiery yang. She was sharp, angular, and moved through the dining room like a shark patrolling a reef. Where Julian was all charm and inspiration, Elise was all discipline and quiet terror. She had a stare that could curdle hollandaise and a sixth sense for the slightest imperfection. A crooked fork, a water glass less than half full, a smile from a server that didn't quite reach the eyes. She seemed to take a special interest in me from the very beginning, though it was not a kind of interest one ever hopes for. She would watch me from across the room, her lips a thin, unreadable line. For the first few months, I was the perfect soldier. I was relentlessly cheerful, my uniform was always immaculate, and I could recite the tasting menu, including every esoteric ingredient and its folksy origin story, backward and forward. I never complained. I took the worst sections, the extra shifts, the tables next to the clattering kitchen doors. I did it all because I believed it was the price of admission. My real work began after my shift ended. While the other servers raced out to bars on Randolph Street, I would linger, offering to help the line cooks with their prep for the next day. Polishing silverware, de-stemming herbs, anything to just be near the heat, the energy, the magic of the kitchen. It was during one of those late nights, while I was meticulously peeling a mountain of pearl onions, that Julian first really saw me. He walked into the silent kitchen, his chef's whites exchanged for a soft black t-shirt, and stopped. He watched me for a moment, my fingers working quickly and precisely. "You've got good hands, Maya," he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Steady." "Sure." My heart hammered against my ribs. It was more than a compliment. It was an acknowledgement. From that moment on, something shifted. He started talking to me, not as a waitress, but as a peer in training. He'd ask my opinion on a new sauce, let me taste a dish before it went on the menu. He was grooming me, and I was a willing, eager student. I started bringing my recipe notebook to work, a worn, leather-bound journal filled with my own ideas, sketches of plating and flavor combinations that woke me up in the middle of the night. I showed it to him. I wanted to impress him, to prove I was more than just a waitress. He'd flip through the pages, a thoughtful frown on his face. "This is good, kid," he'd say. "Really good. You've got the spark." He told me to keep working, to refine my ideas, and that when the time was right, we would find a place for them at Aura. It felt like he was handing me the keys to the kingdom. I trusted him. I trusted him completely. All the while, Elise's gaze grew colder, her corrections more frequent and public. If I made a small mistake, she would berate me at the server station. "Do you even belong here?" she'd hiss, her voice low enough that only I and the staff nearby could hear. "Julian may see something in you, but I don't. I see a girl playing dress-up." I brushed it off as jealousy. I told myself she was just threatened by my growing closeness to Julian. I was a fool. I saw a rivalry, when in reality, I was watching a conspiracy unfold from the inside. The first concrete sign something was wrong was a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I was in the dry storage room grabbing a box of linens when Julian and Elise walked past the open door. Their voices were hushed, tense. "Can't keep dangling the carrot in front of her forever, Julian," Elise said, her voice sharp with irritation. "She's getting too comfortable. She's starting to think she actually has a voice here." Julian's reply was a low, placating rumble. "Patience, Elle. The tasting menu concept is almost fully fleshed out. Her little book has been a gold mine. We just need to handle the timing perfectly. 1 more month, maybe 2, then she's gone." My blood ran cold. Her little book? My book? I stood frozen, my hand clutching a stack of folded napkins, my mind refusing to connect the dots. It couldn't be. I was mishearing. I was imagining things. Julian had been so encouraging, so supportive. He was my mentor. I convinced myself they were talking about someone else, another chef, a supplier, anyone but me. The alternative was too monstrous to comprehend. So I went back to work, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I smiled at my tables, I poured the wine, and I watched the two of them, searching their faces for any sign of the duplicity I had just overheard. But there was nothing. They were perfect performers. That night, I went home, and for the first time, I made a digital copy of every single page in my notebook. A quiet, paranoid little voice inside me whispered that I might need it. The end came on a Tuesday, the quietest night of the week. The dining room was half full, the energy level at a low hum. It was the perfect night for an execution. Midway through the main course service, Elise approached me at the sommelier station. "Julian and I need to see you in the office, Maya. Now." Her tone was flat, devoid of any emotion. The other servers glanced over, sensing the tension. I followed her down the narrow hallway, my server's apron suddenly feeling like a lead weight. The dread that had been simmering for weeks was now boiling over. When I stepped into the cramped, windowless office, Julian was sitting behind his desk, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. He didn't look charming anymore. He looked bored, and on the polished surface of the desk, right between them, lay my leather-bound notebook. "Is this yours?" Julian asked, nodding at the book. His voice was casual, like he was asking about the weather. "Yes, chef," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. "You know what we have a zero-tolerance policy for, Maya?" Elise said, stepping beside the desk. She didn't wait for an answer. "Theft." I stared at her, confused. "Theft? I don't understand." Julian sighed, a theatrical, disappointed sound. "Elise did a stock take of the wine cellar tonight. We seem to be missing 2 bottles of the Euro 9 Screaming Eagle. Very expensive, very rare, and very specific." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "Funny thing is, I remember you asking a lot of questions about that particular vintage last week." My mind raced, trying to catch up. I had asked about it for a customer, a wine collector who was dining with us. I'd needed the information for him. It was my job. "Chef, I didn't steal anything. I would never." "Of course you would say that," Elise said, her lips twisting into a smirk. "But it's a bit of a coincidence, isn't it? The missing wine, and you, the ambitious little waitress who's been spending a lot of time in places she doesn't belong." The accusation was so absurd, so completely baseless, that I almost laughed. But then I looked at their faces, Julian's detached boredom, Elise's undisguised contempt, and I realized this wasn't an investigation. It was a verdict that had been decided long before I walked into the room. This was the moment they had been planning. "My notebook," I said, my voice shaking as I pointed at the desk. "What does my notebook have to do with this?" Julian finally picked it up, holding it delicately between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were something distasteful. He flipped it open. "This? Oh, this is just the sad little cherry on top of the sundae." He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw him without the charming mask. What lay beneath was cold, empty, and cruel. "You have all these grand ideas, Maya," he said, tapping a manicured finger on one of my meticulously drawn plating diagrams. "But you need to learn your place. You come in here with your big dreams, thinking you can just skip the line. Life doesn't work that way." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some people are meant to create, and some people," he pushed the notebook across the desk towards me, "are meant to carry the plates. You are a waitress, Maya, and that is all you will ever be." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. It wasn't just about firing me. It was about breaking me. It was about reducing my passion, my talent, my entire being down to my job title, and then dismissing it as worthless. Elise sealed my fate. "Clear out your locker. I'll have your final paycheck mailed to you. You have 5 minutes to get out of my restaurant." My restaurant. The possessiveness in her voice was absolute. I was escorted out the back service door, the same one I'd stood by countless times after a long shift, dreaming of my future. The alley was dark and smelled of garbage and old grease. The sounds of the bustling kitchen, a world I had desperately wanted to be a part of, faded behind the closing door. I stood there in the dark, clutching my useless notebook, utterly and completely humiliated. A few weeks later, broke and spiraling, I was scrolling through a food blog on my phone when I saw the headline, "Julian Croft Reinvents Fine Dining at Aura with Visionary New Tasting Menu." I clicked on the link, my hands trembling. The article was gushing, praising Julian's genius, his daring. And there they were, listed one by one, accompanied by stunning professional photographs. My seared scallop with yuzu foam, my deconstructed beet salad with goat cheese soil, my smoked duck breast with cherry anise sauce, my entire concept, my soul, laid out on a table for the world to admire, with his name attached to every last bite. The weeks that followed were a gray, featureless blur. I moved out of my small but bright apartment in Lincoln Park, which I could no longer afford, into a dingy garden-level studio in Logan Square with a window that looked out onto a concrete wall and a collection of overflowing recycling bins. I got a job at a greasy spoon diner called The Daily Grind, slinging burnt coffee and lukewarm omelets to weary commuters. The work was grueling, mindless. I'd come home smelling of bacon grease and despair, my feet aching, my spirit bruised. My chef's knives, once my most prized possessions, sat in their roll at the bottom of a moving box, untouched. My leather notebook lay on my nightstand, a constant, mocking reminder of my failure. Julian and Elise, meanwhile, were ascending to godhood. Aura was the restaurant in Chicago. Getting a reservation was a competitive sport. They were featured on WGN News, their faces smiling out from the pages of glossy magazines at every checkout counter. Julian was the visionary artist, Elise the brilliant operator who made his dreams a reality. One particularly cruel article in the Chicago Tribune quoted an anonymous source close to the restaurant who mentioned a troublesome former waitress with delusions of grandeur who had to be let go for theft. I knew, with a certainty that made me sick to my stomach, that it was Elise's words. They weren't just content to steal from me, they had to salt the earth where my reputation once grew. I tried to fight back, in my own small, pathetic way. I called a lawyer, a cheap one I found online, who offered a free consultation. I sat in his dusty, cramped office and laid out my story, my voice cracking with a mixture of rage and shame. I showed him the digital copies of my notebook pages, the dates on the files predating Aura's menu launch by months. He listened patiently, steepled his fingers, and then gave me the soul-crushing reality. "It's your word against a celebrated chef's," he said, his tone sympathetic but firm. "You have no contract, no written agreement. Ideas in and of themselves aren't legally protectable. He'll say you were inspired by his kitchen, that you developed these ideas under his tutelage. It's a he said, she said, and he's the one with the microphone and the $1 million restaurant." He told me a lawsuit would cost tens of thousands of dollars I didn't have, and that I would almost certainly lose. I left his office feeling smaller and more powerless than ever. They seemed untouchable. They had the money, the fame, the power of the press. They had my dreams, and they were flaunting them for the whole world to see. I fell into a deep, dark depression. I stopped calling my family back home because I couldn't bear the thought of telling them I had failed. I avoided friends, embarrassed by my new life, my waitress uniform a constant, itchy reminder of Julian's final cutting words. Chicago, a city I had arrived in with so much hope, now felt like a cage. The glittering skyline I once saw as a promise now seemed to mock me, each lit-up window a life that wasn't mine. I was drowning, and the worst part was, nobody was even watching. Julian and Elise had already forgotten I existed. I was just a piece of trash they had swept out the back door. The breaking point came on a miserable, rainy Thursday. I had just finished a 10-hour double shift at the diner. A customer had yelled at me because his toast was too dark, and my manager had taken his side. My shoes were soaked through, my back was screaming in protest, and I hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. I was broke, exhausted, and utterly defeated. I trudged home, the rain plastering my thin jacket to my skin. When I got to my apartment, I found an envelope taped to my door. It was a formal eviction notice. I was 2 months behind on rent. That was it. That was the bottom. I slid down the hallway wall, the rough plaster scraping my back, and just sat there on the grimy carpet, the eviction notice clutched in my hand. I started to cry, not with loud, angry sobs, but with silent, hopeless tears. This was it. I'd have to pack my bags, tuck my tail between my legs, and go home, defeated. Julian was right. Elise was right. I was just a waitress. I don't know how long I sat there in that dim, musty hallway, but eventually the tears stopped. A strange, cold calm washed over me. I looked at the eviction notice in my hand, the stark black letters, a final testament to my failure. But then I thought about my parents, who had worked so hard their whole lives to give me a shot at my dream. I thought about my grandmother, who had been the one to buy me my first set of real knives, telling me, "There's no wound salt, and time can't heal, and no problem a sharp knife in a hot pan can't fix." And I thought of Julian's smug, condescending face. "You are a waitress, Maya, and that is all you will ever be." Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift. The despair didn't just vanish, but it was suddenly joined by something else, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. rage, a pure, clean, clarifying anger. They had underestimated me. They thought that because I served their tables and polished their glasses that I was weak. They thought that by firing me and stealing my work, they had erased me. They were wrong. They hadn't erased me. They had forged me. Sitting there on the floor, with nothing left to lose, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. And I was done being a victim. I wasn't just going to get back on my feet. I was going to build an empire on the ashes of their restaurant. The first step was survival. I called my landlord, swallowed my pride, and begged for a 2-week extension, promising I'd be paid in full. I picked up every extra shift at the diner I could, working until my feet were numb and my eyes were gritty with exhaustion. Every dollar I made, I saved. During my few precious hours off, I lived at the Harold Washington Library, not in the culinary section, but in the business and legal stacks. I read everything I could get my hands on about restaurant financing, business law, health codes, and payroll regulations. My enemy had corporate lawyers and PR firms. I had a library card and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. I wasn't just going to be a better chef than Julian. I was going to be a smarter business owner. I started paying attention to the gossip in the restaurant world, the whispers between line cooks and servers who moved between kitchens. I learned that while Aura was a critical darling, it was a nightmare to work for. Paychecks were often late, overtime was rarely paid, and Elise's verbal abuse was legendary. Julian, for all his talk of philosophy, was rarely even in the kitchen, preferring to spend his time at press lunches and charity galas. He wasn't a chef anymore, he was a brand. And brands, I was learning, could be fragile. My chance came in the form of a faded for-lease sign in the window of a defunct taqueria on a sleepy corner in Logan Square. It was small, run down, and in a neighborhood that was up and coming, but not yet trendy. It was perfect. It was all I could afford. I called my grandmother, laid out my entire plan, and asked for a loan. I didn't ask for a handout. I presented it with a full business plan, profit and loss projections, and a repayment schedule. I poured all the meticulous detail I once reserved for my recipes into that proposal. 3 days later, the money was in my account. She believed in me. I signed the lease and got the keys. The place was a wreck. The kitchen was coated in a thick layer of grease. The dining room was painted a garish orange, and the plumbing was questionable at best. For the next 3 months, I worked like a woman possessed. I tore down drywall, scrubbed floors, and taught myself how to tile a backsplash from YouTube videos. I haunted restaurant auction websites, buying used equipment, a sturdy 6-burner stove, a dented but reliable prep table, a mismatched collection of plates and silverware. I called in every favor I had from my brief, happier time in the city. A plumber I'd served at the diner gave me a discount on new pipes. An electrician I'd once shared a beer with rewired the whole place for the cost of materials. Slowly, painfully, the space began to transform. I painted the walls a warm, inviting charcoal gray. I hung simple, bare bulb pendant lights. I named it Hearth. It was the opposite of Aura in every way, small, unpretentious, honest. It was mine. Hearth opened on a cold night in November with no fanfare, no press releases, no celebrity guests. My staff consisted of me in the kitchen and a former colleague from the diner, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, running the front of house. We had 12 tables. The menu was tiny, just 5 appetizers, 5 entrees, and 2 desserts. It was composed of dishes that were mine, truly mine, but simpler, more rustic versions of the complex plates I had designed for Aura. I couldn't afford the yuzu or the imported truffles, so I used what was local, what was seasonal, what I could get from the farmer's market down the street. It was food born of necessity and passion, and it was the most honest cooking I had ever done. For the first few weeks, it was terrifyingly quiet. We'd have a few curious neighbors wander in, but most nights we barely broke even. I'd lie awake at night, the numbers swirling in my head, the fear of failure, a constant bitter taste in my mouth. But I didn't give up. Every single plate that left my kitchen was perfect. Every customer was treated like royalty. Sarah and I worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and sheer stubbornness. Then a local food blogger with a small but loyal following came in one night. He wrote a short, glowing review of my roasted chicken with crispy potatoes and garlic confit, a simple dish, executed flawlessly. He called Hearth a tiny gem of sincerity in a city obsessed with hype. That's when things started to change. A few more customers came in, then a few more. People started talking. They talked about the quality of the food, the ridiculously low prices, and the warm, welcoming atmosphere. Social media began to buzz. Instagram posts of my braised short ribs started popping up. We were a word-of-mouth success, the best kind of success there is. Soon we had a line out the door every single night. I had to hire another cook, then a dishwasher, then 2 more servers. I poached them carefully. I looked for people who were talented and hardworking, but who had also been chewed up and spit out by the city's fine dining machine. I found a young line cook who had been fired by Elise for being 5 minutes late. I hired a pastry chef who Julian had publicly humiliated during a service. Hearth became a sort of refuge, a pirate ship crewed by the talented misfits of the Chicago restaurant scene. And we talked. Over late-night staff meals, we shared our war stories. The tales of Aura were particularly ugly. I heard about the systemic wage theft, how Elise would regularly edit time cards to avoid paying overtime. I learned about Julian's deals with suppliers, how he'd get kickbacks for using inferior products and then lie about their provenance on the menu. A sommelier Elise had fired in a fit of pique told me how they would refill expensive wine bottles with cheaper vintages for by-the-glass pours. Every story was a piece of ammunition. I started a new notebook, not one filled with recipes, but with facts, names, dates, specific incidents. I encouraged them to file official complaints with the Department of Labor. I even helped them fill out the paperwork. I was building an army, and they didn't even know we were at war. Meanwhile, Aura was starting to show cracks. Julian was a great marketer, but a terrible manager. With his attention focused on his celebrity status, the quality and consistency of the food began to slip. The bad reviews started as a trickle, then became a flood. Style over substance, one critic wrote. A beautiful room serving soulless food, said another. My little restaurant Hearth was often mentioned in the same articles as the kind of place that was getting it right, authentic, passionate, and delicious. Julian and Elise must have seen it. I imagined them sitting in their sleek, empty office, reading the reviews that praised my restaurant while trashing theirs, and I allowed myself a small, vicious smile. They had created a monster, and it was getting ready to eat them alive. The best part? I hadn't even started my real attack. I was just getting warmed up. The second phase of my plan was about leverage. I knew from my research that a restaurant like Aura, with its prime West Loop real estate and lavish decor, carried an enormous amount of debt. Julian had built his temple on a foundation of bank loans and, as I soon discovered, one particularly large investment from a private equity firm called Northgate Capital. Northgate was notorious. They didn't invest in dreams, they invested in assets, and they were utterly ruthless when their assets underperformed. I made it my business to know everything about Aura's financial situation. My disgruntled sommelier friend still had contacts, and through him, I learned that Julian had recently taken out another massive loan against the business, not for improvements, but to fund his increasingly lavish lifestyle, a condo on Lakeshore Drive, a new Porsche, a research trip to Tuscany for him and Elise. He was bleeding the company dry, using it as his personal piggy bank. At the same time, I was carefully cultivating a source inside Aura's kitchen. A young prep cook named Leo, who I knew was miserable, had applied for a job at Hearth. He was talented and I wanted to hire him, but I asked him to do something for me first. I asked him to stay at Aura for 2 more months. I paid him a weekly bonus out of my own pocket, in cash, for information. It felt cloak and dagger, but I had no qualms about it. This was war. Leo became my eyes and ears. He confirmed the wage theft, the corner cutting on ingredients, and something else, something far more dangerous, the kitchen's flagrant disregard for basic health and safety standards. Julian and Elise insisted on a pristine dining room, but the back of house was a disaster. Walk-in refrigerators were kept at unsafe temperatures to save on electricity. Cross-contamination was rampant. Cleaning schedules were ignored. It was a ticking time bomb. Leo, using a burner phone I'd given him, began taking pictures, photos of overflowing grease traps, mold in the ice machine, boxes of expensive fish left unrefrigerated for hours. He sent them to me every night. I saved every single image to a secure, encrypted hard drive. My little restaurant was now a certified hit. We'd received a glowing review in the Tribune, the same paper that had once printed Elise's lies about me. The irony was so sweet I could taste it. I used the profits and a solid track record to secure a proper business loan. I was expanding, taking over the lease of the defunct laundromat next door to double our seating. I was becoming a real player in the Chicago food scene, all while Julian and Elise were distracted by their own hubris. They still saw me as the little waitress, a minor annoyance, a gnat buzzing at the edges of their empire. They had no idea I was building a guillotine. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I learned that Aura was planning a massive 3-year anniversary gala. It was going to be a huge event, with press, city officials, and most importantly, their investors from Northgate Capital in attendance. It was Julian's chance to shore up his shaky reputation and project an image of success. It was also the perfect opportunity to burn his whole world to the ground. I had my dossier, a thick folder containing sworn affidavits from more than a dozen former employees regarding wage theft, copies of their doctored time cards, supplier invoices that proved Julian was lying about his ingredients, and a flash drive containing all of Leo's disgusting photos from the kitchen. It was a comprehensive portrait of a business that was rotten to its core. 2 days before the gala, I set my plan in motion. I had an old friend from law school, now a practicing attorney, form a shell LLC for me. Through this anonymous entity, he couriered a copy of the dossier to the head partner at Northgate Capital. There was no note, no explanation, just the cold, hard facts. I knew a firm like that would do its own due diligence, and what they'd find would terrify them. Then I waited. The day of the gala arrived. I knew the investors would be there watching. It was time for the fireworks. The night of Aura's anniversary gala was a perfect Chicago evening, crisp and clear. I imagined the scene, the valet line of gleaming black cars, the clinking of champagne glasses, Julian in a bespoke suit, radiating charm and false confidence. I wasn't there, of course. I was in my own kitchen at Hearth, which was, as usual, packed to the rafters. But my mind was a few miles away, in the West Loop. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the peak of their dinner service, Leo sent me a one-word text. Now. From a payphone a block away from Aura, untraceable, a former server I trusted made an anonymous call to the Chicago Department of Public Health. He didn't just make a vague complaint. He gave them specific, verifiable details, information only an insider could know. He told them exactly where to find the mold in the walk-in freezer, about the improper food storage under the main prep station, and the broken sanitation cycle on the dishwasher. He told them it was an emergency, a public health crisis in the making. An anonymous tip from a civilian might be ignored for a day or two, but a detailed, urgent report of multiple critical violations at a high-profile restaurant on a Saturday night, that gets a response. By 8:15 p.m., 2 city health inspectors were walking through Aura's front door. I had timed it perfectly. The dining room would be full, the kitchen in the chaotic throes of service. The inspectors, armed with my specific intelligence, bypassed the pristine dining room and went straight for the kitchen's weak points. Leo described the scene to me later. The controlled chaos of the kitchen ground to a halt. Julian, summoned from the dining room, tried to turn on the charm, but the inspectors were immune. Elise tried to intimidate them, threatening to call her lawyers, but they just clipped their badges to their coats and continued their work, making notes on their clipboards. They found everything. The photos hadn't lied. Within an hour, they slapped a bright orange license suspended notice on the front door. The restaurant was shut down, immediately, mid-service. The guests, a mix of Chicago's elite and the stone-faced partners from Northgate Capital, were asked to leave as the staff stood by in stunned silence. The public humiliation was absolute. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The story of the city's most celebrated restaurant being shut down by the health department on its anniversary night was a lead story on the morning news. But that was just the beginning. The investors from Northgate Capital, already spooked by my anonymous dossier and now witnessing this public implosion, acted swiftly. Their lawyers found a clause in their loan agreement pertaining to business negligence and illegal conduct. They called in their entire loan, effective immediately. Julian and Elise didn't have the capital. They were leveraged to the hilt. The wage theft lawsuits, which my former colleagues had filed weeks earlier, were now public record. The scandal was a perfect storm, and Julian and Elise were caught in the center of it with no life raft. Their empire crumbled in less than a week. They were forced into bankruptcy. Their suppliers cut them off. Their staff quit. The glowing articles were replaced by headlines about fraud and failure. Julian Croft, the visionary chef, was revealed to be nothing more than a con artist. Aura, the temple of modern cuisine, was now just a crime scene. 3 months later, I stood in front of the dark, empty building that once housed my greatest pain. The vibrant energy was gone, replaced by a dusty silence. The license suspended sticker was still, peeling off the glass door. My lawyer, a sharp, savvy woman I'd hired with the profits from Hearth, stood beside me, holding a thick folder of legal documents. I had done it. Using my own success and an investor who was impressed by my business acumen and grit, I had formed a new company. And that company, through the bankruptcy proceedings, had just purchased all of Aura's assets, the space, the equipment, the liquor license, for 10 cents on the dollar. I pushed the key into the lock of the front door, the door I had once been thrown out of. It swung open with a soft click. I was home. We spent the next 6 months gutting the old Aura. We tore out the cold, pretentious decor and replaced it with warm woods, soft lighting, and a massive, open kitchen that would be the heart of the restaurant. We kept nothing of the old place except the good bones of the building itself. When we reopened, it was as Hearth, West Loop. It was an instant, roaring success. We had twice the space, a bigger kitchen, and a team of the most talented, loyal people in the city. I was no longer just a chef. I was an owner, a leader. My name was the one in the magazines now, and my story, the one I chose to tell, was of a waitress who worked her way up through grit and passion. The darker parts, the story of the theft and the revenge, I kept for myself. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, about a year after we opened, Sarah came into my office. "Maya," she said, her expression unreadable, "you have a visitor." I walked out into the dining room, which was being prepped for dinner service, and there, standing by the host stand, looking thin and worn, was Elise Vance. Her expensive clothes were gone, replaced by a cheap coat that was frayed at the cuffs. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was dull and lifeless. The imperious glare was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow look. She flinched when she saw me. "Maya," she started, her voice raspy. I was wondering if you were hiring. I'll do anything. Wash dishes, bus tables, anything." I looked at her, at this woman who had tormented me, who had stood by and smirked while her partner destroyed my life. I felt nothing, no anger, no pity, not even satisfaction. Just a vast, cold emptiness where all that pain used to be. The story I heard was that Julian had left her, taking what little money was left and disappearing to somewhere in Florida. She had been blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. She was ruined, just as I had been. I thought about all the things I could say to her. I could have screamed at her. I could have laughed in her face. I could have recited Julian's words back to her. Some people are meant to create, and some people are meant to carry the plates. But I didn't. I walked past her to the host stand, picked up a single heavy menu printed on beautiful cardstock, and walked back. I held it out to her. Confused, she took it. Her eyes scanned the list of dishes, my creations, served in my restaurant, a place now synonymous with success and integrity. She asked for a job, but all I gave her was the menu, so she could see exactly what it was she had lost. The end.